Hey everyone, Elon here. All right. I invited Chris Bergen to speak as well. It's intended to be a Starship call, so we got the launch coming up tomorrow. There's a good chance that it gets postponed since we're going to be pretty careful about if it does go wrong. It's a lot to go wrong. Starship is the biggest rocket ever made. Over twice the thrust of a Saturn V, the Saturn V moon rocket, which is the largest rocket ever to get to orbit. Roughly twice the mass. Got 33 engines on the booster. Got 6 engines on the upper stage of the ship. So there's a lot of engines. So I would like to just set expectations low. If we get far enough away from the launch pad before something goes wrong, then I think I would consider that to be a success. Just don't blow up the launch pad. Let's see. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Elon. How are you feeling for tomorrow? What's your predictions, really? Because it's a big ask, isn't it? It's 33 engines, 90% for 6 seconds and launch commit. Do you really think that it's got a good chance of launching first time, or maybe you'll take a few attempts?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Is I think the probability of us triggering a launch abort is since it's the first launch of a new rocket. We've actually never launched the booster before. We've test fired the booster, but we've not launched it. So the chances of us triggering an abort and having to postpone the launch are high. That's why I want to, just set expectations appropriately. This is not like some sort of train leaving the station at precisely 9:03 a.m. or something like that. It's, it's the first launch of a very complicated, gigantic rocket. It might launch tomorrow. But we're going to be very careful, and if we see anything that gives us concern, we'll postpone the launch. If we do launch, I would consider anything that does not result in the destruction of the launch mount itself, the launch pad, stage 0, effectively. I would consider that to be a win. That may sound like I don't know, like low expectations or something, but it's worth bearing in mind that the Russian N-1 rocket, which is probably the closest comparison to Starship, had a string of failures, never reached orbit. And that was when the Soviet Union was at peak rocket capability with the A-team with maximum stick, maximum carrot, meaning like you would be hero of the Soviet Union if you succeeded and off to the gulag if you don't. So maximum motivation, the A-plus team, they still failed. It's worth keeping that perspective. So it may take us a few kicks at the can here before we reach orbit, and then beyond reaching orbit, we've got to bring the booster back and land. We've got to bring the ship back and land. And in order for the reusability to be rapid, it's got to land where it took off, because transporting this gigantic beast around is extremely difficult. So it's got to land. It's got to basically land back on the Mechazella arms. And it's got to do, and then all of this has got to be accomplished while still keeping payload to a useful orbit significantly above 0. We're not like the first ones to think of the idea of reusability. Obviously, everyone was aware of reusability from the beginning of orbital rocket days, but it's just a staggeringly difficult technical issue. We live on a planet where it's barely possible. Like this, if this was a video game, it would be set to a level of difficulty just below impossible. I mean, many people in the public may not realize that rockets are actually, those big complicated rockets are thrown away every time they fly, with the exception of Falcon 9. Falcon 9 is a weird one that comes back and lands. But we lose the upper stage and we have to catch the fairing far out to sea, and even the boost stage, we usually have to land downrange. A lot of people think like a rocket goes up and then gravity stops at a certain point, but that's not actually the case. If you look at a long exposure, you'll see that there's an arc to the rocket flight. You actually only go up vertical for a short period of time, and then you do a gravity turn, you sort of tilt over, and then you start going horizontal to the Earth's surface. So what matters is that for getting to orbit is your velocity parallel to the Earth's surface. It's an imperfect analogy, but like tetherball. The ball stays horizontal if it's going really fast, or a ball in a roulette wheel. It's sort of when the outward acceleration equals the inward acceleration. The outward acceleration due to motion equals the inward acceleration due to gravity. That's when you experience zero gravity. It's going to arc out to sea, Yeah, but we got this is really kind of like the sort of first step in a very long journey that will require many flights. If for those that have followed the history of Falcon 9 or Falcon 1 actually and our attempts at reusability, when you really add them all up, I mean, I think it might have been like on the close to 20 attempts before we actually recovered a stage, and then it took many more flights before we had reusability that was meaningful, where we didn't have to rebuild the whole rocket. Now the Falcon 9 team is a real kick-ass team. I mean, they're just making it look easy, relatively speaking, launching every 4 days or so. Just to give you a sense of what the Falcon 9 team is hopefully accomplishing this year. Is if we do close to like 90 launches, maybe 100, with an average of 17 metric tons to a useful orbit. That's an important part, because sometimes you'll hear these payload to orbit numbers, but they'll be to an orbit that's not useful. A useful orbit would be one where we can take Starlink satellites. That would be a useful orbit. What orbit can we drop them off at? So that means probably on the order of 1,600 tons to orbit this year. The rest of all the rest of the rockets on Earth this year will probably do 300 or 400 tons. Just Falcon 9 will do 80% of all Earth mass to orbit this year, assuming there aren't any major things that go wrong. I think China's like 10 or Chris, you may know this better than I do, like 10 or 12%, and then the rest of Earth is like 8%.
Yeah, it's absolutely dominating. And it's an interesting thing, because listening to you talk, there's so many tie-ins there. You talk about Falcon 9, they're all coming back, one after the other. I hate using the word routine, because you can't use the word routine in spaceflight. But they're all coming back one by one. And you've got people who've worked on that Falcon 9 recovery who are now working in Starship, like Lars Blackmore. These are like genius-level people you've got working there. And that gives you confidence in maybe Starship will have some, it'll have some challenges, but eventually it might work. And then you've got all these boosters and ships down the road at the production site, just lining up, ready to go. And you've got the evolution with Booster 9, haven't you? So it's like, whatever happens with Booster 7, you can get improvements automatically with Booster 9. So you've got like an evolution path where it's not like other rockets, where if they launch and they fail, they've got like a big downtime before they get the next one ready. You've got them all lined up down the road.
Yeah. And I mean, for those listening, I mean, I apologize. Like sometimes we'll dip in and out of like extreme rocket wonk stuff. I'm trying to address things on the level of someone who doesn't know how rockets work, but is curious. And like level 9 wizardry. It's a mixture. Some of this is going to sound like Greek. I mean, to your point, Chris. Actually, the funny thing is, like, we're actually dying to get this rocket off, no matter what happens to it, because there are so many improvements between Booster 7 and Booster 9, literally hundreds. And I mean, for example, like some major ones, like we moved from hydraulic thrust vector control to electric, from Booster 7 to Booster 9. The entire heat shield structure on the base of Booster 9 is completely redesigned for Booster 7. So Booster 7 has kind of a retrofitted heat shield system between the engines, and this is very important, because if you think about it, if you have 33 engines, and if any one of them goes wrong, it's like it's like having a box of grenades. Okay, It's a really big grenades, and so if one of those grenades goes off, you don't want the other grenades to go off too. But we had to retrofit the heat shield, the sort of blast shielding essentially, and heat shield. It's both blast shielding and heat shielding at the base of Booster 7. We realized that the initial shielding that we had was just way too weak. So we've taken that Booster 7 apart, put it back together again so many times. It is an artisanal rocket, artisanry at scale. We just want to take off and move on to Booster 9. There's still a lot to learn, of course. This is also a sort of fully autogenous rocket, so that means we're using gasified oxygen to pressurize the oxygen tank, gasified methane to pressurize the methane tank. Is a tricky situation, because if you the gas is trying to liquefy as you're as you're trying to pressurize a thing with its own gas. Naturally, it wants to cool, and what's called the ullage, the pressure and gas in the tanks. It wants to cool down and shrink as quickly as possible. You're sort of filling it while it's condensing at the same time. How those relative rates work remains to be seen, because we've not done that with either the ship with a booster or with full tanks. There's a question of will the engines be able to provide enough pressure and gas to keep the booster and the ship pressurized? Remains to be seen. But hopefully we'll get good data either way, even if it doesn't work as well as we had hoped. There are many improvements in the valves throughout the vehicle. It's always tricky when you want to have a valve work across a wide temperature range. So you can design a valve that's going to work at really cold temperature, or a valve that'll work at hot temperature, but it's really hard to design a valve that'll work all the way from cryo to hot. There's a million ways this rocket could fail. I could go on for hours.
What would you say? If it does succeed? I mean, I'm talking probably like gets past max Q, maybe staging. That'd be a massive win. Let's face it.
Massive win.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you get to there, though, but if you get even further, will you be thinking maybe chopstick catches in 3 or 4 attempts time, or are we getting a bit ahead of ourselves there?
Depends on how well these launches go. It's an easier move to try to catch the booster. The booster, like that's obviously a thing we've done before, albeit not with chopsticks. When you think about like ground safety, because we want to be very careful about not endangering anyone on the ground. The booster can boost back to the launch pad, and with a very relatively small landing ellipse, so you're not really you can boost back and not overfly populated areas. But for the ship, now you've got a much harder problem, because you're coming in. It's kind of like the space shuttle. You're coming in over the United States, So we've got to make sure that the ship can land accurately, get through max heating, and max heating is extreme. Like this thing's coming in like the ship is coming in like a meteor. It's blazing hot. So does the heat shield work? This is a big question. I mean, I think the heat shield, we know the heat tiles work, but if we have gapping in the tiles, or the hot gas seal at the flaps is quite a dangerous place. That's where the hinge point of the flaps, for the front and rear flaps, it's really difficult to achieve a hot gas seal there, because you've got something that's moving. The flap hinge is rotating, but you got to stop hot gas from getting through there. Then relight the engines and land. It's a lot to be done. So.
I'm sure that people want to talk. I don't dominate the time. There's proper reporters like Kristen Davenport on here as well. So I'll just simply say, I really sincerely. I mean, I've got to be an objective reporter, but honestly, we all hope it works. We all wish it the best. We all wish your team the best, and it's really for humanity, because it's such an exciting rocket. What it can do, the capabilities of it. I'll tell you what, while I'm talking to Elon, if people want to DM me questions, I'll ask Elon the questions you want to ask. That'd be one way of doing it. Until someone else comes on, I've got a quick query about KSC Starship. You got 39A, you got the tower built. Are you still looking at LC-49?
Yeah, we've built the launch tower at 39A. But before we do launches from there, we've got to have redundancy for crew. So that we're building out the ability to launch crew from Pad 40 at the Cape. Now that doesn't give us redundancy against Falcon Heavy, though. So it's like if something goes like we want to use the Cape for kind of operational launches as opposed to developmental. Especially if you got the launch pad, if you got the Starship launch pad right, pretty close to the Falcon Heavy launch pad. If something goes wrong, it's going to be some downtime. So we want to kind of get past the developmental stage here at Starbase before we launch out of the Cape.
Excellent. I found John Krause. I've now got the ability to invite people to speak. John, can you speak and confirm you've got the ability to speak? He's definitely been invited.
Yes, tap that mic icon at the lower left.
Yeah, John, if you can hear us, it's a little thing on the bottom left-hand corner. Mic is on. Just type that to make sure it comes on.
Hey, do you have me now?
There we go.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was kind of just listening in, enjoying the conversation. I think the one thing I'd ask is like, there's kind of that famous phrase, always go to 11. Elon, could you speak in what that's reference to with Falcon, and like, what are the things you look at, going into tomorrow? What is the 11th thing, if you will?
The 11th thing is obviously, partly reference to Spinal Tap, but the the second flight of Falcon 1, the 11th risk was a coupling of the slosh modes of the upper stage liquid oxygen tank with the control frequency of the engine. And I'd asked for the top 10 risks at the time. And I was actually kind of worried about that coupling, but I didn't see it on the top 10 list. And I saw risks. So I thought, well, okay. So now we ask for the 11 in each department, the top 11 risks. Actually, more than that. There's no real limit. But there's volume goes to 11, which is like, louder than loud from Spinal Tap. And then there's like, damn, if I'd asked for the 11th risks, I would have maybe taken some action on it got into orbit sooner with Falcon 1. So that's where that comes from. If you ask me like what my biggest concern is about this launch, I'd say the concerns are similar to what the Soviet N1 rocket faced, which is like you got a lot of engines, there's stage combustion, so it's high pressure, very high pressure engines, very high performance engines. If one of them does let go, does it domino into? Does it take out the other engines or the stage or the launch pad? In which case, very bad day. That would be my biggest concern is losing an engine that cascades into loss of the launch pad is really the thing we're concerned about. So if we blow up the launch pad, and it's really much more of a fireball than it is an explosion, but it's that very big fireball, and it'll melt the steel and slag the launch pad. So it would take us probably several months to rebuild the launch pad if we melt it. So my top hope is please may fate smile upon us and we clear the launch pad before anything goes wrong. That's all I'm asking. Yeah, and by the way, N1 blew up with a launch pad.
Several times.
Yeah,
I've also added Ellie in space, because I know she'll ask you some good questions about Starship.
Hey.
Ellie, you can speak. You're on.
Can you hear me?
Hey.
Yeah.
Hey, Elon, first of all, thanks for hosting this space. This is really great. And I was just curious, in the midterm, what is the priority with Starship? To develop and demonstrate refueling capability, work on the HLS variant, or are you just in general still proving the concept?
No, I think I'm just like I said, I really want to lower expectations as much as possible here, and use as an example the Soviet N1 rocket, which is really the closest rocket comparable to Starship, and Starship is in some ways more risky than the N1. It's a lot more thrust. It's running a higher chamber pressure. It's a full flow stage combustion, and it's got a cryogenic fuel. Cryogenic fuel has the added risk of fuel gasifying and forming a fuel oxygen pocket, which then if you get a fuel ox pocket forming that lights off, it's a gigantic boom. So even if it happened in an engine compartment, it would really be quite bad. Now we do have. We are running nitrogen purge on the as much as we possibly can on the engines that on the launch pad, and then we have a CO2 purge in flight, so that should mitigate the risk. But you can if the engines can always leak faster than you can purge. that's possible, and then you can, like I said, get a fuel air combination, and that is the curtains. So it's a very risky flight. This is not something that is a sure thing at all.
I guess I'm just wondering, in the next few months, if we see a successful flight, what happens next?
Yeah, I think I just need to set expectations that it probably won't be. And maybe the second one will be, and maybe the third one will be, but probably tomorrow will not be successful. If by success one means reaching orbit. This is not to say that there's something we're aware of, that if it was something we were aware of, we would deal with it, but there isn't anything we're aware of. It's just a very fundamentally difficult thing. That's why I prefaced it by saying that the Soviet rocket engineers, which really was the entire Warsaw Pact, frankly, their combined capabilities still resulted in failure despite maximum motivation, and they were the A-team. So just please set your expectations appropriately. That is success is not what should be expected tomorrow. That would be insane. So, but we've made a number of improvements with it. Anyway, I sorry, and I will need to go back to work shortly. So, what actually matters here is the fact that we are building rockets at a rapid pace. So we've got Booster 9, Ship 26, almost ready to go, and we have a steady cadence of rocket production afterwards, and with significant improvements between each iteration of the rockets. So you can think of the payload for this mission is information that allows us to improve the design of future Starship builds. That is our only goal. If we get any information that allows us to improve the design of upcoming builds of Starship, then it is a success. It is purely learning. So, yeah, that's really what matters here. Now, in the long term, so it's so difficult to predict what will happen between now and then. But in the long run meaning, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, we should achieve full and rapid reusability. The physics of this design allow for that in a way that Falcon 9 does not. Because we've got much higher performance engines, there's some economies of scale, and we're using a propellant that is a higher ISP. So, but full and rapid reusability will mean that the cost of a Starship flight will be less than the cost of an expendable Falcon 1. So meaning maybe it's $1 million per flight, or a few $1 million per flight, or something like that. If you have a high flight rate and you have full and rapid reusability, even a rocket the size of Starship might be $1 million a flight or something. So, which just kind of boggles the mind. And then you combine that with orbital refilling, which requires sort of a ship docking with a ship, which we know how to do because we've figured out docking with Dragon. And if we're docking with ourselves, that's way easier than docking with the space station. So like the exciting thing, I think, is that this is an actual path to being a multi-planet civilization. Like that success, the fact that success is one of the possible outcomes is the amazing thing. Now we need to make it from being one of the possible outcomes to actually being probable. That's very difficult. So we've got an arduous, 2 or 3 years ahead of us, with probably many bumps on the road. But at the end of that, we should have something that enables a base on the moon and a base on Mars. And we really are designing this for just an extremely high mass flux to the moon and Mars. And you can do both. So, but you really need an immense amount of mass. Rough order of magnitude, probably 5 million tons to useful load to Earth orbit to get to 1 million useful tons to Mars surface, which is probably what you need for a self-sustaining civilization. And in order to pass the great filter effectively, one of the sort of Fermi paradox great filters, which is, are we a multi-planet species or not? Mars has to be self-sustaining, which means if the ships stop coming for any reason whatsoever, Mars must not die out. That's really the threshold. And then we as a civilization need to achieve that threshold before global thermonuclear warfare or any other kind of event that eradicates civilization. That's the essential test. So which comes first? Hopefully there's never World War III, but there might be. Or it could also be the case that civilization gradually subsides and dies, in a whimper with adult diapers instead of with a bang. But either way, we've got to make hay while the sun shines, and we are at this brief moment in civilization where it is possible to become a multi-planet species, and hopefully that window stays open long enough for us to actually do it. That's our goal. I think we got a chance, but it's less dicey.
Hey, Elon, this is Joey. Can you hear me? Yeah, Joey from Reuters. Just real quick. I guess this goes back to Ellie's question. What kind of testing cadence are you expecting after this mission? I guess either in the scenario that something blows up along the way, or if it's flawless. How many more missions, I guess, before we see some real hardware going to space? Thanks.
I'm just saying we don't know. This vehicle could make it all the way to orbit, or it may blow up on the pad. So I would encourage people to review the history of the Soviet N-1 rocket, which is really a very impressive rocket design. But never reached orbit, and one of the missions blew up the entire pad. So we don't know. If we knew, we would take action. But I reviewed everything with the team today, and nobody can think of anything that would make a big difference to our probability of success. So therefore we must move forward and give it our best shot.
Have you gotten any clarity, I guess, on the costs that you're targeting for building these things once it gets into a production rate? And how much did this particular Starship system cost to build, if you know?
It doesn't really actually matter what this particular vehicle cost. It'd be a bit like saying, if you've got a soap factory, what did your first bar of soap cost? Well, $10 million. But that's not actually what the bar of soap cost, because what matters is what does it cost at volume production. So and then if you've got a fully reusable rocket, now you're not throwing it away every time. So if you're not throwing it away every time, then what matters is your cost of propellant. Now our rocket is methane oxygen, roughly 23% methane by mass, 77% oxygen, and we want to actually try to maybe push the oxygen percentage a little higher. So it's mostly oxygen, and the cost of liquid oxygen is roughly the cost of electricity. So because you just pull it out of the air and liquefy it, methane is the cheapest fuel that exists. So it's one could get the cost of propellant in theory well below $500,000, and then it's like, well, how many flights do you have, and what's the refurbishment cost per flight? And then how often do you fly? That determines you divide the capital cost by how many times you fly. So we see a path to, at volume, on the order of $1 million or $2 million per flight total cost. For over 100 metric tons to orbit. And these are absurdly good numbers by historical standards. To get for it to even be remotely possible to do 100 tons for $1 million to orbit fully. That's just boggles the mind, frankly. It's so far beyond. But the important thing is that is one of the possible outcomes. So that for other rocket designs, there are several orders of magnitude away from that, and that is not one of the possible outcomes for the other rocket designs. So, for any given endeavor, you should always ask: is success in the set of possible outcomes? If not, you've got a real problem. At least in this case, it is in the set. Now, then, once it is in the set of possibilities, then you work on improving the probability.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And about the orbital refueling tests, what kind of, testing timeline do you imagine with that? Do you do that in parallel to other types of tests, or when should we, expect those?
Well, we're not going to try to refill. And I use the word refill because technically it's mostly oxygen that we're transporting up there. It's call it, I said roughly 77% oxygen, 23% fuel. At the point at which these things are going up and coming down reliably, that's when we aim to do orbital refilling.
Good afternoon, Elon. Just a quick question here. This is Austin Masisto from Everyday Astronaut. In terms of your launch tomorrow, can you share, obviously the payload bay door is welded shut, but did you guys put anything in there? Obviously, we've had a history of some interesting items on inaugural launches. And then what helped you get to the decision to not try to attempt to soft land Ship 24 near Hawaii, since Booster 7 is doing a boost back burn and doing that in the Gulf? Thanks.
There isn't any possibility of landing the ship, soft landing it. That would mean putting legs on it. Put legs on it. You shift the center of gravity, the center of mass rearward, and then you have to put ballast in the forward section. So it's not a simple matter to try to land it somewhere. What matters is, it looks like I said, that we need to set expectations low. If it gets to orbit, that's a massive success. That's more than the smartest Soviet engineers could do at the height of their powers, with maximum motivation. And they weren't aiming for, at least the initial iteration was not. The N1 was not a reusable rocket. This one is. So we've got a few years to go before we can count on reusability.
And just to round it off here, for tomorrow specifically, and whatever other times, what are the biggest factors holding that up, and what are kind of the biggest things you're worried about going into that performance-wise and just success-wise? Obviously, you mentioned earlier that clearing the tower, getting off is a big win. But are there anything that you're pretty concerned about going into it?
I mean, I have a concern list a mile long. Like I said, my main concern is that when we light the engines, that the engines, none of the engines explode, and that if one does explode, that it's contained and does not domino into the other engines or the stage. You've got 33 engines that all need to work, or if one does not work, that it does not cause destruction of the vehicle. That's really all I'm concerned about here. And it needs to get far enough away from the launch pad such that if something does go wrong, it does not cause destruction of the launch pad. That's it. And anything above that is I'll be jumping for joy. So
I think a lot of us will be jumping for joy. Maybe I can ask a final question for you, Elon. This is Zach from CSI Starbase. I feel like I've watched very, very closely over the last 2 or 3 years, and I like to be critical just to let people know what's going on, because I feel like sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding of what's actually happening out there. And I guess I won't ask you too technical of a question, but I guess based on what you initially thought was going to be the biggest hurdle, what was the actual largest hurdle to get this first launch underway? Because obviously there was tons of GSE issues, tons of actual vehicle issues, structural structural qualification testing, but like if you had to pick out of all of the things that you guys came up against leading up to this biggest day, like what was the hardest thing to get over in order to reach tomorrow morning at 7 a.m.?
It's hard to say which is the hardest, because it's sort of it's kind of like what's the hardest, or what's the hardest relative to expectations. I suppose that, if one to pick one thing, it would be the engines. We had to do a complete redesign of the Raptor engine because it was just Raptor 1 was simply not reliable, and almost impossible to make. So complete redo of the Raptor engine for Raptor 2, probably the single biggest thing that set us back 6 to 9 months probably. And then we had a lot more challenges with the ground system, which is underappreciated, because it seems like it's just the ground system that's not so hard, but actually the ground system is very difficult.
I promise you that I appreciate it. I've noticed every single change along the way, and it's been interesting. I mean, just from my point of view, it seems like most recently you guys definitely drastically increase the amount of sensors in order to make sure that everything goes flawlessly. I feel like a lot of people don't really appreciate the amount of changes that you guys made over the last few months in order to kind of make this go off flawlessly. I mean, I don't know. I feel like the GSE just doesn't get covered enough overall, even from SpaceX, letting people know what's all involved in just getting this off the ground. So, I don't know if you have any comments on just a huge thing that you wish didn't happen leading up to this or something like that, GSE related.
I can't really think of one single thing. I mean, I guess in retrospect we should have gone with kind of relatively off-the-shelf vacuum jacketed horizontal tank or propellant, instead of trying to kind of make our own. We call them the hot dogs, the big horizontal vacuum jacketed tanks.
Right.
So probably should have gone with those instead of trying to build our own. But I would like to just say that the importance of the ground side is really, it's just as important as the boost stage and the ship. So you can think of I call the ground side stage 0. And if you get stage 0 wrong, then you're going to have the worst day of all, where you blow up the launch stand and the rocket. So getting the ground side working well, because the ground side is also controlling. When you start up the rocket, the ground side is what's controlling the abort. So if you have an issue with the engines or the stage or anything like that, and you've got to detank and save the stand, then you're reliant upon your stage 0, your ground equipment, to keep the whole thing safe, and all the software and logic that goes with it. So just trying to big plug for just the stage 0. Even though it doesn't fly, it's just as important as stage 1 and 2. So, all right, with that, I got to get back to work, guys. So,
hey, if I can, just one quick question. What do you think the chances are this thing actually lights up and launches tomorrow, or do you think there's a higher chance of a scrub?
It's more likely to scrub than
go to Tuesday and Wednesday, or do you think there might be some longer scrub?
I don't know. Depends on the issue.
Thanks, Elon.